Whare Wānaka Aoraki, Link University Excellence Series. Ko granted with Toku Noa. I'm the Vice Chancellor here at Link University, and it's an absolute pleasure to host this event this evening. We've got this Excellence Series been going on at Link University for nearly 2 years now, where we're looking at academic leadership and applied research excellence that define Lincoln University. Tonight, we are delighted to spotlight the work of Associate Professor Amber Parker, a leading researcher in viticulture and climate change. Associate Professor Parker's research focuses on environmental drivers of grapevine growth and fruit development. She has made major contributions to understanding phenology and how temperature and water stress affect grapevine physiology, berry chemistry, and ultimately wine quality. Her work also explores how cultivar and rootstock diversity may offer adaptive potential in the face of climate change. This afternoon, Amber will share her insights into how climate change is reshaping grape production and what this means for some of our most iconic wine. Thank you, Amber.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No ingarani, no kote rana, hoki aku tūpuna, ko Amber Parker Takawinwa. No Aotearoa o, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. You have noticed that my ancestors, my generations came from England and Scotland. I'm a Christchurch girl. And today I'm here to talk to you about how the climate change shapes the future of wine. Wine. When we think about wine, we think about these landscapes all around the world. Memories, perhaps, for some of you of travelling abroad, going from the left there, the Rheingau in Germany, Porto and Portugal in the middle, and the south of France, if you look, the Pyrenees in the background in the Languedoc-Roussillon region. I get a little bit starry-eyed about our glasses of wine. So I just want to show of hands. Who here in the room today are here because they are wine enthusiasts? I'm sorry, there's no tasting. But there are wines here. Who here in the room are wine researchers? Sorry? Wine researchers. Yeah, great. Thank you. Keep up the good fight there. Who here in the room love a good graph? Yeah. So driven by science to be here. So let's start today with the good graph. Now I'm just going to debunk a myth here that wine research, that we spend our time tasting, and of course because we're responsible, spitting wine out after tasting it over time, and of course then our research outputs increase. Now we're actually no different to any other researcher in the room. We're probably more driven by coffee time, right, for our research outputs. For us as wine researchers, I'm actually a viticulturist, so that's just a fancy word for a grape grower, someone who studies grapes. And all viticulturists and hopefully all winemakers recognise that good wine is made in the vineyard. So you need good grapes at harvest to make a good quality wine. If you have bad grapes at harvest, it's very hard to dress it up. You can also have good grapes at harvest, like what I started with one of my research wines, and then make a bad wine, and that becomes resources for teaching about wine faults at Lincoln University. But at the heart of this is that understanding how grapes change with climate change is critical for the future of the wine industry worldwide. And researching wine is pretty important. If we look at the global context, grapes are the top 5 for fruit and vegetable production worldwide, with 7.1 million hectares around the world, 45% of that in 4 countries. And the latest OEV press release, though, starts to flag a few things to us of importance. Production is reduced. It's the lowest in the last 60 years. And to quote that press release, This is largely due to unpredictable and extreme weather events in the northern and southern hemispheres caused by climate change. So the global wine industry is feeling the pinch of climate change. Starting seeing headlines like this: European heatwaves cook French wines. The battle to save Burgundy's vineyards from extreme weather. How climate change is redrawing Europe's wine map. And heatwaves prompt early harvest across French vineyards. And I'll never forget when I had a visiting academic join me who studies climate change impacts on grapes at Lincoln University, Iñaki Garcia de Cortazaratari, who showed me these pictures from a heat wave in the south of France when they had 46 degrees. That's game over if your grapes look like that. Pictures of brown, crispy leaves on grapevines. So the wine industry is facing the real experience of climate change, and they are adapting. For example, in Bordeaux, the past 2 years, some regions have been allowed to irrigate. Now, this is a traditional area of wine production with a high amount of regulation. They've been allowed to irrigate, basically prevent vine death and vine stress. If we look at the New Zealand context, and I think we all like to see the world this way, right? $2.1 billion New Zealand export value is our wine industry. It's the second largest horticultural crop produced in New Zealand after kiwi fruit. 42,000 hectares. 78% of that is Sauvignon Blanc and 82% is produced in Marlborough. Now, if we do some back of the envelope calculations, someone can fact check this and correct me if I haven't quite got them right. That's 95 bottles of wine per person who are 20 years or older. And note, we like our sheep facts. That's equivalent to about 3.3 sheep per person. Now, in an era of drinking responsibly, I think 95 bottles of wine per person, perhaps excessive, and which means our export is really important for our wine industry as well. So the state of the climate in New Zealand is recently involved in a couple of research papers here that looked at the state of the climate beyond the boundaries just of grape and wine production. And we had a little piece on grape and wine production, but some of the key take-home messages were that in these past few years, 3 of the growing seasons with the hottest ocean atmospheric heat waves on record were recorded, corresponding to a plus 1.2 to a plus 1.4 degrees above average air temperatures over land and sea surface temperatures. So, as a grape and wine industry, we're not sitting asleep under the tree while climate change, extreme weather events are happening all around us. And we really need to be proactive in understanding our impacts and our adaptations to be sustainable in the future. So today I'm going to take us through a bit of a journey around some of the impacts of climate change for grape production, and then finish on a wee opener around adaptation. Now, we asked the wine industry about their top priorities, and this was work carried out in collaboration with Joe Fountain, who's here today, and Nick Craddock-Henry from now the BSI, looking at the biggest challenges in viticulture. And from this graph, you can see the biggest bar there is labour shortage, and I think labour is always a concern for the wine industry, cost and people to do this. But after that, the next ones that come up are those associated with weather and climate, extreme weather events, water availability, season to season variation, and those that are slightly indirectly associated like pest and disease. So we know that the industry in New Zealand are thinking about it. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to step us through 4 key areas: climate in New Zealand wine growing regions, what we know about it, phenology and berry composition, and how this is important for our understanding for the future of wine and wine quality, and finally a point on adaptation. So let's start with the climate. We published a chapter with, I'm just going to point people out in the audience here, but Professor Andy Sturman from University of Canterbury and Hervé Canol from CNRS, looking at the climate variation in our grape regions in New Zealand over a historic period. So this is using temperature data through the period from the 1960s to 2010 and looking at a heat summation called the Hughlin Index on the y-axis there. Now, hexamation, essentially, we take temperature data, we sum it up over the growing season, and we say we can use that to inform us whether in a cool climate, warm climate, temperate climate situation. And we did this for the various growing regions in New Zealand. What you can see from that is for Napier and Queenstown, we've seen an increase in temperatures over those 5 decades, increase of 200 degrees growing degree days by the Hughlin Index. And Nelson and Blenheim didn't really show so much change. Now that story has evolved, particularly with those heat waves that I talked about before, where we can actually characterise now that the average temperatures have increased during the growing season as well in our wine regions. Some of our current climate challenges are important for us to characterise now and then hopefully understand and build on for future climate change interpretation of impacts and adaptations. So there's been a long-standing study out of Waipara where there's been a network of climate sensors and a network of phenology monitoring. And from those climate sensors, climate models have been downscaled to 1 kilometre resolution, which is really relevant to the grower. That's at the plot level as a vineyard grower. And through this, you can characterise the impacts or what kind of climate that we've been having. This is an example of spring ground frost. And this is a problem for the wine industry. If you have a spring ground frost and it occurs when your shoots are growing, it kills the shoots basically, and you have to start all over again the growth for the season. So we need to have an understanding of that risk and how we can protect against that frost. So characterising that's really important. In the context of climate change, with warming temperatures, we could see that shoot growth earlier, and those spring ground frosts may still occur, which increases our risk. So understanding at this scale is really important and useful for our wine growers. And you can see here for the Waipara region, the average of the spring ground frosts range from that 5 to 10 through that September-October period right now we're going through. Now, other current climate challenges are, of course, drought, fires. We can learn a lot from our neighbours across the ditch in Australia who've been dealing with smoke taint for a very long time in their wines. And just even talking to Joe coming back from Canada, the fires in Okanagan are quite problematic. And also, we're all very aware of the situation of too much rain when you don't need it in our wine regions in New Zealand. This kind of climate information we see here is really useful for a viticulturalist who's interested in understanding impacts of climate change. We can use the temperature data from these sorts of models to then look at projections of climate in the future and how that's going to affect our grapevines. So that moves me on to my next point, phenology. So phenology is defined as the study of stages of growth and development in the life cycle of living organisms. And for the most part, temperature is a key driver. Now, I really like this picture at the bottom here because it encompasses a lot of things we see in a vineyard. That's not just the grapes. You've got insects, you've got birds, you've got cover crops. So there's a whole ecosystem in a vineyard. And all of these organisms have their own phenology. And what we know is with temperature being a driver of phenology, with increases in temperatures from climate change, we can expect there'll be changes in the phenology of these organisms. So we like to think of phenology as a bioindicator of climate change, where our canary in the coal mine to understand what is happening with climate change. Now, most of you probably studied phenology in some shape or form. So I just want to remind you that while we talk about this for crops, right now we see phenology in the real world all around us. The copi, camellias, cherry blossoms, daffodils, all flowering at this point in time. Who has observed changes in the timing of that flowering over the years, say in Hagley Park? Right?
Could be getting earlier.
Could be getting earlier. So this is the type of information that tells us this is the bioindicator of climate change. If temperature is driving that and phenology is advancing because of temperature, we can see this in the world around us. Now, as a viticulturalist, I study one of the most inspiring flowers that you'll ever see on a plant. It looks like that. Now, I don't think we walk around walking in a vineyard or driving past a vineyard and think, oh, wow, it's beautiful. Our grapes are in flower. Now, each one of these tiny, tiny little things here is a flower on an inflorescence. These ones are closed and this one here is open, so it means it's flower. It's being germinated, fertilized, and hopefully going on to form a berry. So I like to think of our inflorescences when we've got lots of flowers on them. They're like, I guess, like the butterfly story. It's kind of your caterpillar, goes through flowering a bit further, it's getting a bit ugly like a chrysalis, and then eventually we end up with a beautiful bunch of grapes. They're also really interesting flowers in that they're kind of like an anti-flower, right? That little cap pops off backwards. So rather open up and display nice colours, it just kind of throws it off. That petal's not that pretty and goes on to making a berry. So studying phenology for the grapevine, what we follow predominantly is bud burst, when our shoots start growing, flowering, that process of the capful, veraison, when your red varieties go from green to red berries, and that signals the start of the ripening phase, when all the sugar comes into the berry and all those flavour and aroma compounds change. And in white varieties, it goes from green hard to green soft. Now, with the wine culture being entrenched in history and lots of notations, we've got really good data around the world around phenology and monitoring whether or not it has advanced over the past years. So in a publication that we did in collaboration with France, they have long data series monitoring the phenology in Riesling and Alsace, and over the last 70 years, bud burst has advanced by 10 days, flowering 23 days, veraison by 39 days, and harvest by 25 days. So that's shifting the time at which those berries are going to accumulate all those things that are going to influence the wine quality. If we look since 1989, we know that our temperatures have skyrocketed since then. That flowering, for example, is advancing at a rate of 3 days every 10 years, and veraison 6 days every 10 years. Now let's have a little look closer to home. If we take Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, they look a bit like flat lines, but notice the x-axis, we don't have quite as long data series, and they actually do have a slope to them, with flowering advancing 3 days every 10 years, and veraison advancing 0.4 days every 10 years. And the time to a target sugar concentration, a metric that we can use of the berry towards harvest, advancing 2 days every 10 years. So we need to watch that space and see how this continues to evolve. And we need to keep collecting the data to understand this further. Now, a big part of the work that I've been involved in is developing phenological models. I'm not going to sit up here and throw out equations and take you through all the techniques about that. But what we do is we take temperature data, we take observations and develop a model and say, can we use that model to predict the timing of key phenological stages? So first of all, we need to see if it stands up against historical data, and then we can use it, if we're happy with the model, to project potential climate change impacts on phenology for grapevines. So we did this for Chardonnay and Champagne, and you've got four squiggly lines there actually. At the bottom here, you've got flowering observations, and there's a light green line there, which is also the predicted flowering biomodel that I developed. And then at the top here is the is a harvest date and a time to sugar concentration relevant for the Champagne area. We're quite happy with how these models performed. So then what we can do is combine them with RCPs, or the latest climate change projections. So we did this for RCP to 4.5 and 8.5 and see what's going to happen to phenology in the future. And from this, what you can see is that we can project those advances. RCP 4.5 is kind of your plus 1.5 to 2 degree scenario. We've actually kind of surpassed that one. And RCP is your 8.5, which globally is talked about as plus 4. In New Zealand context, often a plus 3.7 degree increase. So you've got options here now as a bit of culturalist. You either harvest early to retain sugar concentrations, you harvest late, you have higher sugar, higher alcohol, and a change in your composition, or you adapt and you implement some practices to shift the story and retain the same time of harvest. So we're going to pivot to looking at phenology for the future of our iconic New Zealand varieties. And I'd like to introduce you to the bunch. First of all, we've got Superstar Sauvignon. Now, these are names I've come up with. There's no scientific background to them. I've just labelled it Superstar Sauvignon because it's our flagship. It's our key part of our industry. Puts out a good yield, pretty stable berry size, potentially lower management inputs than some of our other varieties. So we're pretty happy with this particular character in our setting. Brings in the dollars too. Some of you might like your mainstream Merlot. Now, Merlot, I named him, her, mainstream Merlot, simply because quite happy to make a wine on your own from it, but also likes to hang out with the crowd with Grenache and Mourvedre and Syrah, for example. And finally, the funniest one that ChatGPT spat out to me, because of the title I gave it and the quality of the image, is Perfectionist Pinot. Could not get those two words on the same line. Could not get a happy looking bunch. I wanted serious, and that's what it came up with. Right now, why I label this Perfectionist Pinot? It's our leading red variety, but it is, and we've got people in the wine industry here, it is challenging to manage. Bit fickle at flowering time, isn't high yielding, light in colour, which could be affected by climate change. So sometimes challenges us in our production sense and also coming through to the winery. So what's going to happen to our iconic New Zealand varieties in the context of climate change? So in New Zealand, we have 12 wine regions varying through latitude. And for the rest of this story, I'm going to focus on these three regions: Hawke's Bay, Marlborough, and Central Otago, and each variety in those. So in collaboration with Anne Gale-Lucia, who's now at the Ministry for Environment, and Richard Law at BSI, we started looking at our projections in the New Zealand context for Sauvignon Blanc flowering, veraison, and time to target sugar concentration. So for this work, they mapped out areas that could be considered suitable for grape and wine production. Then we used the models that are developed to simulate the timing of flowering. Once we've done the testing, to say that we're okay with how they perform on a baseline data set. So that's the first image over here, baseline period. And then looked at the temperature for climate change projections in combination with those models for future periods, mid-century and end of century, and looked at whether or not that phenology was going to shift. Now, this is RCP 8.5, that's sort of 3.7 to 4 degree increase by the end of the century. What you need to look at is the scale on the right here. In the middle, these colours here mean that there's no shift in phenology, and as we go further in this direction of coloration, the phenology is advancing. So you can see by the mid-century, we're up to a week advance in flowering for Sauvignon Blanc and Marlborough, and up to 2 to 3 weeks advance by the end of the century under this projection. If we start looking at the harvest information we push out by the end of the century, we're in the red, over 3 weeks advance. So that means we're shifting our harvest earlier, potentially into a warmer period. And that is undoubtedly going to impact our wine quality. Right, a shift to 10 to 20 days of timing is going to change that balance of all the metabolites in the berries that are important for wine composition. We can, with this understanding of projections of timing of phenology, we can then look at what climate is doing between those different developmental stages. So in recent work with Richard again and Nick, we simulated the rainfall changes at certain developmental stages, phenological stages for the grapevines between budburst and flowering veraison, and veraison and harvest relative to the baseline. Now, Central Otago is quite a dry region, so having an increase of spring rainfall is probably seen favourably, but on a baseline that's quite light already for rainfall through from flowering to harvest, having additional deficit is not ideal. So either irrigation is going to change, but we also need to future work look at what's happening over the winter period to fully understand the whole picture. So what's the future for our iconic New Zealand varieties? I'm going to show you probably the most tricky graph to interpret today, so I'm just going to walk you through this one. Okay, these bars that we see that are vertical, this is the window in which we say Sauvignon Blanc right now goes through those phenological stages in Marlborough. So if this is the ideal timing relative to the climate, then we probably want to retain that timing. If we can't retain the timing, we have to be mindful that the impacts of climate change will shift our wine style. We use the projections, so through the different RCPs from there's RCP 4.5, plus 1.5 to 2, up to RCP 8.5, the plus 4 degrees, and modelled the advances. So you've got averages, and of course there's variability around them. And what you can see is you go from current to the most dire situation of climate change, you're getting substantial advances in your phenology. We can do this for a range of varieties within a region, and you can see for Pinot Noir, which is considered an early ripening variety, quite well suited to cool climate, same thing happens. When we start looking at later ripening varieties, Merlot and Grenache, even under those warmer climate scenarios, we're outside of that ideal window. So the wines we drink today will not taste the same in the future, these advances, unless we adapt. Now that may not be a problem, right? Sauvignon Blanc in the 80s will taste different to what we drink for Sauvignon Blanc now. So I don't want everyone to go away and cry into a glass of wine or a coffee cup that they won't be able to get their favourite wine in the future, because market will decide some of the trends of style. But as growers, if we're finding having too hot conditions at certain times of the year is a problem, we need to adapt. An example of this change that's already going on, we can look across the ditch again to Australia. Now, they have been feeling the impacts of climate change in grape and wine production. Cabernet Sauvignon, green notes from methoxypyrazines is no longer an issue there. Methoxypyrazine give us positive green notes in Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand. What's going to happen to that if climate change has this effect of shifting our development, therefore the time in which and how berries ripen? So that brings me on to the third part, berry composition. This is where we start talking about the potential quality. And this was one of the headlines that came out from one of our publications, led by Dr. Romy Mukazu, who's in the audience today when she was doing her postdoc with myself and Olaf and Brian Jordan. And we were really interested in diving a bit deeper into how that berry composition might change with increasing temperatures. Now, at Lincoln University, we're fortunate enough to have growth chambers, so we can do some model system work, put potted vines into the growth chambers under different climate conditions. So from veraison to harvest, when those berries are going through all those changes to accumulate sugar, change their primary and secondary metabolites, which may directly or indirectly influence wine quality, we exposed the vines to 2 different temperature regimes and then looked at the effects on the berry composition. And some of the key take-home messages that we got from this was at the top here, under warmer conditions, we had more sugar. Now that is well known. We're seeing this globally. People are fighting elevated alcohol in their wines because sugar gets converted to alcohol through the fermentation process. So under warmer conditions, we have to manage the situation. We also saw, and here's just 2 examples from the publication, changes in amino acids. So they increased the total amino acids under warmer conditions. And when we broke this down to individual amino acids, we saw things like proline increase. Now, yeast don't use proline when you ferment to make wine, but proline certainly affects mouthfeel through sweetness, viscosity, and reduces astringency and bitterness. So increased temperatures through changes in berry composition is ultimately going to change your wine style. At the signings, decreased. They're important for colour. With Pinot Noir, perfectionist Pinot Noir, somewhat underperforming in the colour arena, this could be a problem going forward in the future. So that brings us to the last point about adaptation. Now, this in itself is a whole nother talk. So I just want to give one example to get us thinking about how we can adapt, how we can change our practices, perhaps to manage the impacts of climate change, shifting phenology forward, and then changing temperatures during maturity, influencing our berry composition. So let's go back to this figure here. And what we're trying to achieve, let's say our hypothetical situation is we want to retain our ripening at this time. We want to retain our veraison at this time. We want to retain our flowering at this time. So we need ways to shift those advances in phenology back into those windows that we see as ideal. Done a lot of work at Lincoln. I started this journey actually during my PhD now 16 years ago, looking at how we can use leaf removal as an adaptation to climate change. So defoliating a canopy removes the powerhouse, removes the photosynthates that feed the berries and slows the ripening process. Doing this after you've gone through flowering and you just have the first sign of your berries, so what we call bunch closure, the phenological stage of bunch closure. So well before veraison, well before the ripening period, was able to achieve for veraison a 4 to 8 day delay. Now, according to this figure here, if we're looking at the end of the century, plus 4 degrees, these tiny little arrows here represent that shift, and we're not reaching the window, that target window of our timing of veraison, that purple line there. So this could be a technique in the short term that we could use to delay our phenology, but perhaps long term on its own won't push the system enough. So when we come to adapt, it's really important that we need to start thinking about the interactions of and layering in multiple adaptation strategies in order to deal with the shift that we could potentially have in our phenological timings. In my work, I've characterised the timing of flowering and veraison for about 100 varieties, and the timing of time to target sugar concentrations for over 65 varieties, from early, such as Pinot Noir, right through to late varieties that you might find in Greece. Varietal diversification is one of the tools in the toolbox we can use to adapt. So we could stay with what we've got. If you look overseas, we even see in places like, again, Bordeaux, where we have a history of tradition of having Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. Merlot's coming out and Malbec's going in. They're changing varieties to adapt to new climate change conditions. Now, I'm not saying we need to do that here because wine styles change, but it is perhaps one of the most transformative actions we can take for adaptation to climate change in the wine industry. But we certainly have a lot of short-term techniques like this leaf removal that we could use, and we could layer a few together to retain what we do and what we're best known for. So on that note, going forward, how will climate change shape the future of wine? We've covered off climate in New Zealand wine regions, and there's some areas that this research is ongoing. We don't really understand a lot around the extreme weather events, and there's certainly uncertainty packed into our projections. So climate models have their uncertainty. Which climate model, using averages, understanding the range of those models, is going to become more and more important as we go forward in the future. Phenology, we're always dealing with variability, and we really need to start drilling down to sub-regional and vineyard level information because that's what the growers need. When it comes to berry composition, there's plenty of research to be done in this space. Region, variety and wine style are going to drive the priorities there, and that's where we need to partner really well with industry to find out what are the things that they want to know going forward. And finally, as illustrated by that leaf area example, adaptation's not a one-tool solution. There's multiple strategies. Bringing more than one strategy together is going to be important. But most importantly, we need to start measuring, we need to start testing and managing and adapting. And as I said, it's probably a chat for another day. Feel free to ask any questions about it as well, but it's a big topic in itself. So on that note, I'd like to just acknowledge the Lincoln Bunch, those people who have been involved in some of this research, our collaborators, national and international, all the co-authors, funders and wineries on the publications that were presented, that I've also been a privilege to be involved with in terms of those projects. These characters here for joining us on the journey today. Thank you. And the reference list at the end, and open for partai. Thank you.
That fascinating presentation. Plenty of time for questions. Philip, please.
Yeah, hi. Nice presentation on the effect of climate on berry quality and changes. But I guess CO2 increases will also have an effect in terms of lower nitrogen levels, so lower proteins in amino acids in grapes, as well as increased sugars. So do you need to study both interacting since they're both occurring at the same time, or is the climate effects magnitude bigger in terms of berry quality?
The interactions is generally a space that's now only starting to get studied. So if we look at water and temperature, for example, water, carbon dioxide and temperature, there's not so many studies that have tackled them. So you're right in saying that that's really important to look at those interactions. The longest study around the carbon dioxide is in Geisenheim. They've had face chambers. They've had chambers in the vineyard where they've elevated the carbon dioxide and measured whether or not yield and composition changed. Do you remember if they did the amino acids? We were just, I didn't get on that tour. Oh yeah, well, we didn't touch that.
Neither. I do believe they have measured primary and secondary metabolites in general, so mine is still part of them as well, but I did not know the results.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely an important consideration.
They haven't published yet on those, so that's
No.
yeah.
The question I want: how far away are we from sort of physical time barriers and control of our temperature and climate in vineyards?
So that's actually a really good question. So, and that is an area that we are going to embark on for research. So agrivoltaics is one way to reduce temperatures in the vineyard. There's a physical barrier with the dual use land outcome, and that's going to go on at Lincoln, and that's a key focus. As we know that when you have solar panels, that your temperature benefits for frost. It's elevated potentially, but as you go through the ripening phase, you are delaying ripening. So that's one example. I haven't seen other places rolling out big enclosures per se. But yeah, that's one area.
The question.
With Sauvignon Blanc, it's almost all of Marlborough is mass selection. And what would happen? Do you see any future in actually selection of varieties selection within varieties to actually get more so that they'll adapt themselves in a variety that's been selected, rather than this mass selection that they've had throughout Marlborough?
So 2 comments to that. The Marlborough wine industry is based on one clone, and it's based on one rootstock predominantly, 3309. I think it's about 70% of the industry. So biodiversity of our key production area is limited. Second part to that answer, BRI, we've got in the room today, have an extensive program trying to increase that diversity within our Sauvignon Blanc and find solutions to potentially to help us deal with climate change challenges. Do you want to make any comments to that, Daryl, as a group leader?
Say that there are 6,000 new clones of Sauvignon Blanc here on campus as well that we're doing selections on. So yeah, absolutely, that would be one of the traits to select.
Yeah.
Thank you. Joanne.
Thanks, Amber. That was great. I'm pleased to see you mention that extreme weather event hasn't really been explored because, as you know, I've just come back from the Okanagan, and the big issue there is that they have a 70-degree temperature range. So last year they lost 90% of their grapes, 95% because of a polar vortex, but they're also getting summer temperatures into the 40s. And so talking to the growers there about how do you adapt to predictably unpredictable extreme.
So the question, how do they adapt?
How can one adapt?
Yeah.
Because I mean, there are lots of climate modelling.
Yeah.
How do you adapt to the knowledge that there's going to be more extremes, but you don't actually know when or where or how or what those extremes are going to be?
So I think there's a couple of comments that it's around framing you're thinking about climate change. First is understanding trends. So today I presented a lot of trends. Then is understanding seasonal variability and extreme weather events, and the type of work that Andy and Hervé have been doing, for example, around the spring frost, using the data that you have and the information that you've already experienced. You can start modelling and understanding, you know, the risk around previous seasons and the frequency of the risk that is occurring. I'm not a climate scientist, so I can't speak as to how far down the road climate predictions are around, or how well they do how well you can predict extreme weather events, but that's going to be, I guess that would be, you know, the sort of the golden ticket to be able to know that information. Do you have anything to add as climate scientists, Andy or Hervé?
No, only that you've got the mean temperature trends that you've talked about, but then there's also we've noticed in our research, and I've been doing some research just recently in a different context, but that in parts of Australia and New Zealand, for the same because we have the same basically atmospheric circulation systems that are affecting us, daily temperature range has increased. So if the mean is going up, and that is affecting the phenology, and the basically the minimum temperature is staying the same, you're getting the same amount of frost in the same time frame that we've always had them, and yet the plants are responding earlier in the season. So it creates a greater risk, not just for grapevines, but I'm working with some other crops at the moment, and they've got exactly the same problem situation. Thank you for that.
Please, and then to you, Tim. After that.
Can we do the same type of adaptations for biodynamic wine regions? Because I mean, there are limits to what you can do if you still want to call your wine biodynamic, right? Because you're looking at it as an ecosystem, and I think we have some in New Zealand as well.
So the question, if I've understood correctly, can you do the same type of adaptation for biodynamic wine growing? Depends on what your adaptation is. So late pruning, which delays phenology, that can be aligned to biodynamics or organics, potentially. Particularly organics, maybe not biodynamics in terms of what the seasonalities are. Canopy manipulation can be employed during the growing season. So, I mean, a lot of people remove leaves anyway in the vineyard, so you're just doing that maybe more heavily. If you're looking at adaptation where you might be testing so there's anti-transparent compounds, for example, which have been demonstrated to delay and slow ripening, they're probably not going to be necessarily matching up with the values of that system. So it really depends on what your adaptation approach is.
And Tim, perhaps.
Great talk, Amber. Really fascinated by the phenology and what that can tell us about climate change signals. And you talked about the classic case there, which is the cherry blossoms, which is a data set that goes back probably around about 1,000 years or so. Are there any, or probably not similarly long-term, but what's the longest-term data set that we have for grape phenology in the world? And how far back does that go, and what does that tell us about climate change over that period?
I'm not sure the longest in the world. In terms of what I accessed, I used a whole bunch of historical data to develop my models, and I got data back to 1950s in French wine growing regions. I know there's harvest dates go back further. I've seen publications over 100 years. I suspect if we dug around and if people have kept the records in good condition, there's stuff that goes back a lot further than that. But haven't laid my eyes on it yet.
Thank you, Amber. Absolutely fascinating presentation. And insights into vineyards, wine, and that climate adaptation that is very important. It's certainly a really interesting presentation that you put across here today. So thank you very much. I've got a little presentation here for you. I'm not sure if there's wine. It's not tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join us out in the foyer for some drinks and small refreshment. Thank you very much.